We Caribbean, a special program in which we discuss and analyze the issues affecting the region, giving a voice to those who are impacted. It's their concerns, their issues, and their triumphs on We Caribbean. I'm your host, Doris Volo. Trinidad and Tobago has just under a month to go before a crucial general election set to take place on August 10th. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley made the announcement on July 3rd. His ruling People's National Movement is challenged by the main opposition party, the United National Congress. 41 seats are up for grabs, begging the question, who will lead the country going forward? And with us to unpack this is political analyst from Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Bishnu Raghunath. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we know that the Prime Minister announced that elections will take place on August 10th. What can we expect?
Well, we could expect a very interesting 1-month period of campaigning. Not only are there the two major political parties, the People's National Movement and the United National Congress, but there are about 10 other parties which have indicated their interest to contest in this election. And clearly, there's that concern as to whether or not those parties will be able to make inroads within what has been traditionally known to be a two-party system, where parties, where the society literally is polarized into two different groups, and more importantly, their support seems to have always been for one group or the other. So clearly, we are going to be seeing an interesting election campaign as to whether or not third parties can finally make inroads into our election system.
Now, Dr. Raghunath, since gaining independence in 1962, Trinidad and Tobago has largely had a two-party political system, with race being a major factor. What role would you say race relations would play in this upcoming elections?
I definitely think that race is going to be a critical factor in this election. Again, the People's National Movement is largely or heavily Afro-Trinidadian oriented. The United National Congress is largely Indo-Trinidadian consolidated. So it is in that context that those two are the major parties. Those two parties would continue to mobilize. And while they may not overtly campaign on race, on the issue of race, clearly there's that message that is going to be sent. It's either our parties in power or their parties in power. And subliminally implying it's either our race in power or their race in power. And that is the context in which I think that the election will play out. And race is going to continue to be a critical factor. Now, race is not going to be the only factor. And I want to make this very clear. Race is not going to be the only factor. There are other factors that are going to be taken into consideration as citizens consider who to vote for. The government has just come off a very successful COVID-19 suppression plan, which means that they're going to be taking credit for that and going to be campaigning on that issue. But there are other critical issues, particularly so the economy and crime, which the opposition is going to take the incumbent party government to task for. And that could impact significantly on how people would vote as we move into the election.
Actually brought me to my next question, because I would have liked to have asked what other issues you think would be swaying voters this time around, because we did see some protests taking place in the capital where police officers were on camera having shot and killed 3 people in the Morva area, and then a committee was set up to treat with issues affecting these areas which have been deemed crime hotspots. So apart from that, what other issues would you say are of importance for the voters in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, clearly, as I said before, the economy. Even before COVID-19 hit, Trinidad and Tobago was in a bad economic place, in the context of saying that we were oil and gas dependent economy. And the prices of oil and gas internationally have fallen significantly. and so too has the production levels in Trinidad and Tobago. And we have not yet diversified the economy sufficiently well to move away and to get away from the negative impacts and the shocks that we would have gotten from the falling oil prices. So that is going to be critical. In fact, COVID-19 exacerbated a bad situation to some extent because, for instance, we now have several of our energy sector plants on idle or shut down. And the impact of COVID-19 on the economy as a whole is expected to further significantly impact upon employment levels. If people are not able to work, people are not able to purchase the commodities, they don't have the disposable income, that will impact upon their quality of life as we move into the future. The government, to some extent, could say that they have been spared that immediate blow of the economic challenges with COVID-19. And I say spared because what happened in the last 3 months was simply that the government was able to access what we call the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to draw monies down to use to cover some of their normal expenses. They've also gone ahead and borrowed a lot of money from the CAF, from the World Bank and so forth, that will allow them to cover expenses as would have been incurred with the challenges related to the COVID-19 restrictions and lockdown and economic challenges, but also to deal with some of the other economic issues that they've had. So in a way, the government has benefited economically, but again, that is really a short-term benefit that that would tie them over probably for the next 2 months. In the context of simply saying that the government, the Prime Minister called an election within a matter of 38 days, or given notice that the election would be held in 38 days, that in itself carried with it a message. The implied message there was simply one which says that the government is supposed to go back to the national parliament with a budget in September or at latest early October, because the budget must be passed before the end of October. And clearly, because of the state of the economy, the government did not want to take that risk of having to bring that budget in September. Hence the reason why it was easier to call the election now, and devil take the hindmost, depending on whoever wins the election, will then have to bring a budget to the parliament. A budget which will be significantly impacted upon, not only by COVID-19, but by the state of the national economy, as well as the international economy, which we are seeing is being significantly impacted upon by the issues with relation to COVID-19.
There's been a lot of talk surrounding the government's foreign policy as it relates to the country's dealings with Venezuela, the alleged breach of the Rio Treaty. What sort of impact would this have on voters' decision going forward?
Well, clearly, again, as I stated earlier, there's that divide. And that divide in terms of our politics, in terms of our parties, and supporters of the PNM, which is the government in power, they will not use that as an issue. In fact, they will not do anything to undermine their leadership at this point in time. So they will continue to manage their campaign and on issues, keeping away from that issue with the Venezuelan government. However, the opposition forces, and when I say I'm not only here talking about the United Nations Congress, but several of the other opposition parties which are contesting the elections, have all indicated that they are going to be utilizing that issue, which means simply the government's relationship with the current Venezuelan authorities, and the possibility of that causing Trinidad and Tobago to find themselves in difficulties with its relationship with the United States of America, which is opposed to the current Venezuelan administration. So that from the opposition point of view, they are going to take that issue to the ultimate end. They're going to be trying as much as possible to use that to discredit the government, and in saying that the government has continuously put Trinidad and Tobago in harm's way, particularly so when they are looking at our relationship with the United States, and we needing to maintain that relationship. So that issue of the Venezuelan vice president, for instance, coming to Trinidad and Tobago in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdown, and literally with the borders being closed, but special permission was given to her to come to Trinidad and Tobago, that is going to be seen as an issue. Alongside that would be the issues, for instance, with any other issues surrounding Venezuela. So, for instance, there was a shipment of oil from gas from Trinidad to Venezuela. Of course, it was not initially stated that it was going to Venezuela, but it, in effect, broke the embargo which the United States had placed on shipments of oil and gas to Venezuela. In the issue that I referred to here, it was suggested that the oil and gas was bought to be supplied to Aruba, but then Aruba came out and says they never was interested in buying that oil and gas from Trinidad, and the vessel never docked in Aruba, and it could only be suggested that that oil and gas ended up in Venezuela. And there have been questions by the opposition parties, by analysts on the whole, as to whether or not that oil and gas was part of the reason for the visit by the Venezuelan vice president late in March. So those are the issues I think that will come up with regard to the foreign policy as we move forward. What is the relationship of Trinidad and Tobago with the United States? What is going to be the future relationship with Venezuela under the Maduro regime? And if so, how can we walk that line where we maintain the position that we are non-partisan, but of course, other people will make other issues out of it. So that's part of the foreign policy that we really have to deal with as we move forward.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in just a minute. Welcome back with me now to continue our discussion on Trinidad and Tobago's upcoming election is political analyst Winford James. Mr. James, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Now, The country's borders are still closed, and the opposition, including the opposition leader, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, they have raised criticism over the government's decision to host the Caribbean Premier League while keeping the borders closed to citizens and preventing them essentially from participating in these elections. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, CPL is sport, right? And it's sport within the Caribbean, right? I don't know that the government is generally opening its borders to the cricketers who will be participating. So that special permission has to be given because the borders are not tightly closed to the extent that they cannot be opened every now and then. Every so often, there are people who the government allows in or brings in. For example, students have been brought in from across the Caribbean, and people across the world, by special request to the Minister of National Security, have been coming in. So the cricketers who will be, the foreign cricketers who will be participating in the CPL will have to be given special permission. But there is that option that trainees who are outside can exercise.
Based on the fact that we are currently in a pandemic, how would you say campaigning has been this time around?
Well, I'm waiting for the activities of the different political parties to unfold because I myself don't know exactly how they might proceed with trying to win voters over. It is clear, of course, that all of them will use walking about, what we call going into the communities and walking about, meeting the villagers and burgesses, depending on where, and inviting their support. I also think that they'll be using the various social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Zoom, so there will be a variety of online media that they will avail themselves of. I'm not so sure what will happen with respect to the usual public meetings at well-established political meeting spots. I haven't seen any of that just yet, but I'm wondering about the extent to which they can have that. So I'm waiting to see.
We know that there are 41 constituencies up for grabs. I mean, there are strongholds and then there are marginal seats. Do you think that there will be any major shift this election?
Well, one does not know. Elections can be unpredictable, especially given the trend across the Caribbean of voting out incumbents, regardless of how the opposition performed when they were in office and, of course, performed in the parliament. So there's a certain unpredictability. I think both major parties have a chance once they can use the right kinds of arguments to convince people to vote for them. But we don't know what issues they will be prosecuting on the platform just yet. Because, as I said, the traditional way of raising these issues has been through public meetings. Online, you can prosecute any number of issues, but I'm talking about a schedule and a schedule of themes and issues that speaker after speaker on a platform will speak to and speak about.
You mentioned some of the issues that have yet to be disclosed as to what will be spoken about on political platforms by either side. We do know, however, that the United National Congress has attacked the government's foreign policy, especially as it relates to their dealing with neighboring Venezuela. How does this, or play into voters' choice going forward, as well as what are the main issues for the voters across the country?
We will only know when we do the polls. The polls have to ask potential electors specific questions on the foreign policy that you just mentioned there. One can't even use one's own snapshots of the views of people in order to know, because those snapshots, because they are personalized, are likely to be inaccurate of how people are feeling. So I personally await polls that ask that specific question, but I can say that there's a certain polarization.
The opposition leader has called for international observers to be invited into the country, and this is something that has happened before. The Prime Minister would have had, each Prime Minister actually would have had observer teams from CARICOM as well as the Commonwealth in years past. But she cited the political crisis that is taking place in Guyana at this point in time. So the question is the opposition leader seeking to build a case to deny the credibility of these elections on August 10th?
I don't know that the opposition leader is doing that, but she wants to have observers here. The basis can't be what has happened in Guyana, because Trinidad and Tobago has its own status and its own experience. And respectfully, I do not see that Trinidad and Tobago has a state of affairs that commands that there be observers. However, because we are strong leaders within CARICOM, and because we have developed close ties with one another in CARICOM for a long time, if there is a need, if it is felt strongly enough that there be observers, we can have a CARICOM team. I don't go for the international observers. As I said, our status is clear. We don't have those the problems that some countries do. We certainly don't have the problems that Guyana does. And therefore, I am not calling for an observer team. What I'm saying is that because the government will have the last word on this, if the government thinks that, okay, there's no harm that can come from having the team, then perhaps they should allow CARICOM to have an observer status. But I don't know that that is necessary at all, given our experience with our politics.
Now, we've also seen allegations by the opposition leader that the government has allowed its supporters entry into the country with no evidence to support this. How dangerous are these claims to the credibility of the polls?
Well, there are one or two high-profile people who have been allowed in. And on the opposition side as well. Let's take two high-profile members of each party. One of them is Penelope Beckles, right? Who came in and was screened for the Arima seat and actually won. And then you have Barry Paradat. I think he's Princestown. He was outside for a good while and he came in. Now, those people could not come in without the permission of the Minister of National Security. So I don't know the numbers. What I'm saying is that, remember I said earlier that the borders are closed, right? That is their practical status. However, the borders are open every now and then to allow certain persons and certain groups of persons to enter the country. So I don't know that the opposition can launch a serious attack against that policy. But it would be nice to see them, if they think very strongly about it, it's nice for them to put it to the population, and the population will decide.
Yeah.
But it's not as if one knows the answer definitively at all. The government has this device of using the discretion of the Minister of National Security to allow people to come in. You know, but the borders are not open. There's no full international traffic between Trinidad and Tobago, air traffic that is, and the rest of the world.
Most definitely. Now, this next question I have for you, you've answered it time and time again, calling for polls, but I have to ask anyway. Would you see that there will be a clear winner at these elections, or can we expect something like a tie, like what we saw in 2001 when the president would have declared the opposition, then opposition, People's National Movement, the victors? Can we see something like this happen, especially because we've been hearing before that the polls might be very close this time around?
In Trinidad and Tobago, the country is split down the middle between the Indo supporters and the Afro supporters. You do have a lot of Indos, of course, supporting the PNM, and you do have some Afros supporting UNC. I think there are more Indos supporting the PNM than there are Afros supporting the UNC. But it cannot be denied. The country is split down the middle racially in respect of political support, okay? And because of that, and the way the demographics are organized in this country, we find that you can have a tie in Trinidad. And that is one reason why the Tobago seats are so important to the PNM, because they are a tiebreaker, depending, of course, on who holds those seats. We can have, if we do have a tie, support moving either to the PNM or the UNC to give them the majority they need to govern in the first place. That would, of course, be a simple majority. And anybody who wins on that basis will have a problem governing or getting legislation passed. But the answer to your question is yes. It's in Trinidad, a tie is always possible. We have had a few ties in the past, as you know. It's not only one. So yes, there is and then the two Tobago seats become the deciding factors in respect of determining who should form the government.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, Mr. James, for your insight on these elections. That brings us to the end of this episode of We Caribbean, ahead of Trinidad and Tobago's general elections on August 10th. Special thanks to political analysts Dr. Bishnu Raghunath and Winford James. For more stories, visit our website at telesurenglish.net. Until next time.